The road home was empty, the air cool and still, when she stopped and looked up at a sky streaked with light. Something about the starlight pulled her attention outward, away from the worries that had been spinning in her head all day. For a few moments, the boundary between where she ended and the rest of the world began seemed softer, less definite. That quiet shift raises a question that has puzzled thinkers for centuries. Why does encountering something vast change the way you experience your own self? A strong emotion was clearly at work, but it did not fit neatly into happiness, sadness, fear, or surprise. It seemed to be something else entirely, a feeling that scientists now call awe. Awe is that blend of wonder and reverence that washes over you when you face something extraordinarily large, powerful, or beautiful. The first instinct is to call it a simple mix of amazement and smallness, but the story turns out to be more surprising. Research suggests that awe does more than just make you feel tiny for a moment. It quietly rearranges the structure of yourself, shrinking one part and expanding another in ways you might not notice at first. So the central puzzle is this: how can feeling smaller than a speck of dust make you feel more connected to everything around you? To begin untangling that puzzle, it helps to look more closely at what awe actually requires. Psychologists have described two key ingredients that turn an ordinary impressive moment into a genuine awe experience. The first ingredient is perceived vastness, the clear sense that you are in the presence of something far larger than yourself. Vastness can come from physical size, like staring up at a mountain, or from symbolic power, like hearing a spoken idea that suddenly changes your whole understanding. The second ingredient is the need for mental accommodation, the feeling that your usual ways of making sense of the world are not quite big enough for what you just encountered. Your mind has to stretch, adjust, and reorganize just to take in the experience, like a camera refocusing from a close-up to a sweeping landscape. Without that stretching, you might feel impressed or entertained, but you are less likely to feel the full psychological shift that marks true awe. Now return to the woman under the stars, and you can see both ingredients lighting up at once. The sky was perceptually vast, an endless field of light that made her body feel almost invisible by comparison. At the same time, her mind was quietly struggling to accommodate the scale, the distance, and the sheer number of visible stars. Her normal frame of reference, built around the size of rooms and streets and conversations, suddenly felt too small to contain what she was seeing. That combination, vastness plus the need to adjust, is what pushes an ordinary night into the territory of awe. Once researchers began to study this emotion systematically, they discovered that awe does something remarkable to the sense of self. In several carefully designed studies, people who experienced awe reported feeling what scientists call a smaller self. Their personal concerns, their daily preoccupations, and even their sense of being the main character in their own story seemed to shrink. But the small self is not the same as low self-esteem or feeling worthless, and the difference matters enormously. Low self-esteem often comes with self-criticism and social withdrawal, whereas the small self of awe feels expansive and connected. Awe seems to turn down the volume on the individual ego without turning it off entirely, and that shift has measurable consequences. For example, in one simple test, researchers asked some people to spend a minute looking up at a grove of towering trees. Afterward, compared to people who had looked at an ordinary building, those who took in the trees were more likely to help a stranger who needed assistance. The vastness of the trees did not just produce a quiet mood. It produced a quiet shift toward greater concern for others. That finding does not mean a single starry sky will fight off illness, but it points toward a deep connection between emotional experience and physical health. The mechanism behind these effects seems to center on how awe reorients attention away from the self and toward the larger world. Much of the time, your mental resources are consumed by planning, worrying, comparing, and checking how you are doing relative to others. A-Way interrupts that self-focused stream, not by scolding you to stop being self-centered, but by overwhelming your processing capacity with something vast. When your working memory is filled with the detail of a waterfall or the sound of a choir, there is simply less room left to run your usual self-referential loops. As a result, the boundary between self and other world becomes more permeable, and the sense of separation that defines so much of daily stress briefly loosens. But pause here and notice a complication that keeps the science honest. Awe is not always a gentle, beautiful feeling. The same two ingredients, vastness and a need to accommodate, can also arise during a threatening event like a tornado, an earthquake, or an authoritarian display of power. In those cases, the self shrinks too, but the dominant emotion may be fear or submission rather than wonder and connection. This is why walking into a vast cathedral might inspire humility and kindness, while standing before a frighteningly powerful leader might instead produce obedience and anxiety. The difference lies in whether the awe experience feels safe enough to open you or threatening enough to make you withdraw. Even when awe is positive, its effects are not identical for everyone, because people vary in how readily they experience it. Some individuals carry a trait called awe-proneness, and they tend to notice and respond to vastness in art, nature, and ideas more easily. Culture shapes awe as well, because what counts as vast or extraordinary is learned partly from the stories, values, and sacred traditions a community shares. A towering redwood, a silent library, a perfectly synchronized dance, or a quiet act of moral courage can all trigger awe depending on the person and the setting. These variations remind us that no single experiment can capture the full human range of awe, but the consistent pattern across many studies is striking. When awe occurs under safe, positive conditions, it tends to reduce the sense of an isolated self and increase feelings of being part of something larger. And here lies the first real turn in the story. The small self is not a loss of identity, but a redistribution of it. The part of the self that shrinks is the part that jealously guards status, tracks slights, and compares endlessly. The part that grows quietly but unmistakably is the part that can listen, cooperate, and feel genuine care for people who are not connected to you by family, tribe, or transaction. Now, consider what this means for the woman under the stars, whose silhouette has been waiting in the back of this exploration. When she first looked up, it felt as though the universe was erasing her. But the psychological evidence points towards something more precise. Her sense of personal insignificance was not emptying her out. It was making room for a self that is more porous and more receptive. In that reclaimed space, the same mind that had been looping through a difficult conversation earlier in the evening began to settle and shift. She did not forget her worries, but her worries no longer occupied every inch of her awareness. And that subtle change is where the practical power of awe begins. Yet no insight about awe would be complete without asking a harder question. What is the cost of ignoring or misunderstanding this emotion? A life without moments of awe is not necessarily unhappy, but it may become more bounded by the narrow parameters of the personal ego. Without the occasional experience of a vast sky, a stirring piece of music, or collective silence in a large crowd, the self can start to feel like a cramped room with the windows shut. When that happens, stress, social comparison, and a gnawing sense of dissatisfaction often take up residence, not because of any personal weakness, but because the self was never meant to run at the center of every scene forever. The mistake would be to treat awe as a rare luxury or a poetic indulgence, rather than as a natural psychological mechanism for keeping the self calibrated. Researchers have begun to find evidence that deliberately seeking small doses of awe through a weekly walk in a natural setting or a regular practice of engaging with art can lift mood and increase generosity. These interventions are modest and they are not cures, but they suggest that awe is a renewable resource rather than a mysterious accident. Now return one more time to the woman standing on that empty road, because something has become clear that was invisible at the beginning. She thought she was having a private emotional moment, but what she was actually experiencing was a reorganization of her social orientation. The starlight was not simply making her feel small and poetic. It was quietly reducing the dominance of the self-focused narratives that had been driving her day. And that reduction is the key that unlocks a more connected, less defensive way of moving through the world. This point is worth sitting with for a moment, because it overturns a common assumption about selfhood. We often believe that a strong self is a large self, assertive, prominent, and visibly in control. But awe suggests otherwise. A resilient self may actually be one that can step back from the spotlight, feel small without shame, and recognize that it is part of an interconnected web. This is not spiritual advice dressed up in laboratory language. It is a direct implication of the way awe has been shown to shift attention, emotion, and identity in measurable ways. Here is the deepest reversal. The experience of feeling insignificant under a vast sky is not a threat to your identity, but an accurate biological signal that you are a small link in a long chain. Your nervous system is not malfunctioning when the boundary of your body seems to soften in the presence of something majestic. It is doing what it evolved to do across millions of years, adjusting your self-perception to match the scale of your surroundings so that you can survive and cooperate. Awe, in this sense, is a momentary recognition that you are tiny and your life is brief, yet that recognition does not need to bring despair. Instead, it brings a quiet clarity. Your worries are real, but they do not fill the universe, and your existence is meaningful precisely because it participates in something larger. From that vantage point, the woman under the stars was not shrinking away from life. She was stepping back enough to see her place in it more honestly. And honesty about one's place in the world may be one of the most important gifts that an emotion can offer. It checks the impulse to treat every slight as a catastrophe and every ambition as the center of history. That check does not eliminate the self. It liberates it from the exhausting duty of being permanently in charge. The climax of this story is not that awe solves your problems, but that it can reshape the container that holds them. After the feeling fades, you return to ordinary life with a slightly altered perspective, and small alterations repeated over time can shift an entire trajectory. The woman finished her walk that night, went back into her quiet house, and found that the conversation that had troubled her hours before now sat differently in her memory. The words had not changed, but the emotional charge around them had loosened, as if the starry sky had absorbed some of the tension. When you understand that awe regularly shrinks the selfish self and expands the social self, you can choose to invite more of it into your life on purpose. A morning sky streaked with pink, a bridge that arches across a wide river, or the synchronized movement of many hands working toward one goal can all serve as portals. You do not need to wait for a once-in-a-lifetime vista. The human mind can find vastness in an unexpected act of kindness just as surely as in a cathedral ceiling. The key is to let your attention rest on something larger than your own concerns long enough for the mental accommodation to begin. The pause between looking and simply labeling what you see is where awe quietly enters, and that pause can be practiced. Yet that small investment returns a harvest of perspective that can ripple through your next conversation, your next decision, and the next time you catch yourself taking your own importance too seriously. The woman under the stars did not become more connected because she worked harder at relationships that night. She became more connected because her self was momentarily unburdened. She glimpsed a version of herself that was not diminished but placed, not erased but reframed, and that reframing left her more available to the people she loves. Return now one final time to that road, that cool air, and those silent lights scattered across the darkness. The awe she felt did not remove her from the world. It returned her to it more fully, with a self that was clearer about its size, softer at its edges, and quietly ready to belong.